and welcome to the homestead. Chores are already done and now I need to head into the house and do a lot of things today. It's going to be a very busy day. I have bread to make, school to do, laundry to put away, and that's just for starters. Hello and welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to be making sourdough bread. These are some sourdough starters that I'm maintaining just on my counter. They can be fed and refrigerated and bread be made about once a week depending on how often you wake them up and feed them. But I prefer to keep them on the counter because my schedule's a little bit crazy, so I want them to be ready to use whenever I want to use them. So last night I prepared a double batch of the San Francisco sourdough starter, and later I'll be making a wild sourdough bread from this starter that I started the sourdough right on my counter following Jill Winger of Prairie Homestead's instructions from her course, and I will be making the bread for this recipe later on. So since I made a double batch of this bread recipe, I actually used 2 cups of the starter, and the recipe calls for 1 cup, but we have 4 kids and they like bread and sandwiches, so that is why I'm making a double batch. Now, this recipe calls for 1 cup of starter, 1.5 cups of warm water, and then to that you add 2 teaspoons of sugar and 2 teaspoons of salt, in addition to 4 cups of regular all-purpose flour. And you mix that together the night before. The recipe book says 12 to 18 hours before you're ready to knead the remainder of the flour in. And you just let the sponge sit and ferment further. And then when you're ready to knead the dough, then you add the rest of the other ingredients. Now this is an oilless French bread recipe, and so it does dry out quite quickly, but it makes beautiful French bread and wonderful French toast, bread pudding, anything that would require a more substantial French bread loaf. I'll set my starter to the side and get going on this bread. Now, as I said, I made a double recipe. So the recipe calls for the initial 4 cups of flour, and then I will knead in an additional 2 cups, and then of course this is a double recipe, so I'll be kneading in 4 cups. But after you let the sponge set overnight, then the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of baking soda. And I believe this has to do with the chewiness of the crust. So now when I make bagels, it calls for baking soda as well. We'll do 2 teaspoons since this is a double batch. And then you just start working the flour in accordingly to your recipe. I'm going to start with 1 cup. The recipe says to work in half a cup at a time, but since it's a double recipe, I will go ahead and do it 1 cup at a time. And yes, I am a messy cook. This recipe says to let it rest 3 or 4 hours, but I found the other day that it was over risen and had almost fallen. This recipe seems to do better letting it raise in the oven just with the light on for a couple of hours, maybe as many as 3 hours. We'll see. I will get this in the oven to rest and raise, and then we will do school. I want to work at least half of the remaining flour in the bowl first. That keeps it going into the dough rather than spreading all over the counter. Now, I do have a KitchenAid over on my counter, but for the purpose of this French bread, I do prefer to do it by hand. I can get the feeling of the dough. I can tell if it needs more flour. I know in years gone by, I've used a mixer exclusively for mixing bread and found that inexperience and lack of practice caused me to put too much flour in the dough, which made the bread, of course, dry and hard to eat. When you're kneading bread in a bowl, you just grab a handful and pull it and push it down. As you get into your own little rhythm, it's really nothing special that you need to know how to do. Now this is not my favorite bread bowl. My mother has a beautiful extra large bread bowl that I grew up using, but I just haven't gotten to the kitchen store and gotten my own. In fact, this is just a bowl from the dollar store. I originally bought the bowl for a coleslaw for a church dinner. I've got almost all of those first 2 cups of flour worked in, and now I will begin kneading it on the table. You just pick it up, push it in, fold it over, and it will become more smooth and elastic as you work it. And you can see that it's still quite sticky as I've only put half of the remaining flour in. But I want to get this little bit worked in before I add more. You want to make sure that you're getting the pockets of flour worked in the whole ball of dough so that you don't have these weird dry pockets of flour when you go to roll out your dough. This is 100% just a sourdough starter that I've used. I've made several batches of this particular recipe with this starter. Now, of course, sourdough being what it is, it all depends on how long you let it sour in the sponge stage, depending on how sour it will be. If you make your bread at 12 hours, perhaps it will be less sour than if you made your bread at 18 hours. I have not tried this theory out. It's never the same because of our schedule with our family and our kids and everything else we have going on here at the homestead. Now I've started kneading it. I'm kneading it for about a minute. The recipe directions tell me to knead this dough for 8 minutes. Now it all depends on your strength and what you can do. But really, kneading dough is just folding it over, flipping it, and squishing it. And I tend to go all out. The recipe says to take a break and slam it down on the counter, and well, that just scares my kids, the dog, and everyone else in the house, so I don't slam it down on the counter. I just keep kneading it for the 8 minutes that it calls for. A little bit more flour, and I just work in the last of the flour. Sometimes I don't get it all in. Now if you're following us on Instagram, you would have seen a picture of this bread on our Instagram the other day. I had posted a picture of our starter jars and a couple of loaves of sourdough bread. And that's what this recipe is. Now here in Wyoming, our air is very dry compared to a lot of the country, especially further south of here and to the east. We don't have a lot of trees. So when I add flour to anything, especially bread or cakes or any type of doughs, very often takes less flour than it would in the east or down south. And that is greatly due to the fact that the flour itself has less moisture in it due to our low relative humidity. So oftentimes when a recipe calls for a certain amount of flour, I either have to compensate by adding more water, an additional egg, a little bit more oil, or just less flour altogether. It just completely depends on the recipe itself. Like when I make pancakes, to make up the difference in the moisture level and the additional oil needed, I just add an extra egg. And then of course make sure that it's the right consistency to make the pancakes. And this is slightly still sticky, which is how you want it. You don't want it completely non-sticky. If you get it to the point where it's not sticky at all, you've probably put too much flour in it. Flour so that this doesn't stick to my counter. I'm going to let it rest. I've moistened this towel. I'm going to let it rest for about 10 minutes. And then I went out and moved the sprinkler to water our backyard grass and checked on the kids. They're outside playing. And now it's time to divide my ball of bread dough, and then I will roll out each section individually and get it put on my pan and into the oven. My last loaf of French bread, almost done. As you can see, I have the others here. The first one was the roughest, and they are rolling out much easier. Starting out with a different shape to the dough, making sure that I start out with an even shape. And then you just work a little bit of flour into it so that it doesn't stick to the surface, just as you would with any dough that you're rolling out on the surface. Trying to make it kind of a long rectangle. The corners don't have to be completely square, because when you grab a hold of it, of course, they stretch out and pull. But you want it pretty even thickness throughout. That way, when you're done rolling your dough up, you don't have one side that's super thick and the other side that's super thin, because it would make your loaf lopsided. So I just start rolling it up from the end, and then when I get a little bit of a roll, then I pinch it. And then I roll it over again and I pinch it. I'm not really pinching it, I'm kind of sealing it down against the roll. And this prevents the roll of dough from expanding and becoming more like how a cinnamon roll is, where it has the loop sort of spiral of dough. You would never know when you slice this bread that it was ever rolled out and rolled back up again. And the key to that is not putting too much flour on your layers. You get it toward the end, and you don't really have to seal it on this last little turn, because then you bring up the last little piece and you actually do pinch this. Now this is very critical that you get this nice and pinched, because otherwise when you're working with the ends of the loaf, then it will separate if you didn't pinch it adequately. So then you just take this bottom little flap and you kind of push the little belly button back in, and then you just pinch it off. You don't want to overstretch this part, because then that layer of dough breaks. And you just kind of pinch it together until it kind of adheres to itself. And then do the same thing on this end. I'm just trying to seal the ends to where all of that spiraling from your rolling it out is completely hidden within the loaf. Now while the dough is resting, I did turn on my oven light so that the oven would begin to heat up. It seems like my oven will stay at about 80-85 degrees, which is what the recipe book says this needs to rest and rise at. So I want to make sure that these are somewhat evenly spaced. That way they rise in a more uniform size. And of course the first one is more rested and has begun to rise already. And then I just take a razor blade and I make these little slits, just very thin. You don't want to cut very deep in. 4 or 5 little slits to give it that decorative French bread look. And you want to do this before it rises, because otherwise if you cut it after it rises, then you will actually deflate your loaf. I prepared some melted butter, and you just brush some butter on top and down the sides. You want to coat the whole thing. The recipe says you can use either butter or you can brush it with water. The recipe does say if you brush it with butter, the crust will be softer. If you brush it with water, the crust will be quite crunchy. Of course, I have small children, so I don't want the crust to be any more crunchy than necessary. I'm going to get it down there in those little crevices as well, because as this rises, you want to make sure that there's enough butter to coat all of the surface, and it will actually coat the surface even as the bread expands. The butter, being in a warm rising oven, stays somewhat pliable. It's not like if you stuck it in the refrigerator. But as with anything on the homestead, a lot of things are a learning experience. Even as an adult that has been baking and cooking most of my life, there are still so many things that I don't know how to do. And the key is living on a homestead, or even if you don't live on a homestead, if you have the curiosity to learn and the willpower to seek out the information and the learning experiences, then you can learn and you can do anything that you set your mind to doing. I do have extra butter, but I'll set it aside for my bread that I'm going to bake later today. I'm going to put this in the oven and let it rest and rise in there for at least 2 hours. Now, because I put the butter over the top of the loaves, I don't need to cover it with any type of tea towel or cloth or anything. You do not cover a loaf of bread while it is rising with either an oil, butter, or a moist cloth, or even a dry cloth. The top surface will actually dry out and it will limit the rising ability of the dough, whether you are using a sourdough starter or you're actually using instant dry yeast. Well, it looks just about right, so I'm going to pull it out of the oven, turn the heat on to 400 degrees, and we'll get it into the oven to bake. Well, the timer's gone off, the bread is done, so we'll pull it out of the oven. Here's the finished bread. This is the second recipe I made. It is mostly whole wheat, so we'll try that. This is just white all-purpose wheat Montana flour that I used in this. This is also wheat Montana, but this is the white whole wheat. And we'll see how the bread turned out today. What do you think? Did it turn out okay?